It is probably the most powerful plant extract for dopamine effects, but because of how powerful it is at controlling the prolactin and all these other dopamine-like effects, yet it seems very safe and easy to play with.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology.
Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 157th episode of this podcast dedicated to the ongoing betterment of your brain, sometimes even by things you thought maybe had nothing to do with the brain. This is such an episode. We're going to be talking about a plant called Vitex, which is probably best known, at least as far as humans go, in that it's long been known to make women's menstrual cycles easier to bear. But it turns out that its effects do not stop there. It actually has some pretty remarkable effects on the dopamine systems in our brain, and we're going to be talking about that in the main interview with interviewee and Smart Drug Smarts alumnus Matthew Legge of ATP Science. And if you hang around until the very end of the episode, kind of keeping it on theme a bit with something related to both female reproduction and brains, I'm going to tell you some interesting and surprising findings about what a woman does reproductively during her reproductive years, what the effects of that can be on her cognition later in life, the kind of thing you might not be taking into account when you're planning your baby making, but is probably a factor that should be thrown into the mix. That'll be in the Ruthless Listener Retention gimmick. But let's start things off, as usual, with This Week in Neuroscience.
Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience.
Okay, so this is a great study. This is one of these things that you have to kind of give the scientist a clap on the back just for even having thought to study this, to measure this, because it's not intuitively obvious that there's anything going on here. But one thing that we all kind of intuitively know from being humans is that human-to-human eye contact is kind of a big deal. If you lock eyes with somebody, it could be a threat, it could be a sexual come-on, but it always kind of means something to sustain eye contact with another human. I mean, really, even with another mammal, you can kind of weird your dog out if you stare at your dog too long. But anyway, these scientists were wondering, does that whatever it is that's going on when humans make eye contact with one another, the cognitive resources that is taking up, does that keep us from doing other cognitive tasks as well? In particular, why is it that when people talk to one another, we tend not to sustain eye contact? If somebody asks you a complicated question, you're likely to stare up at the ceiling or basically someplace other than their eyes when you're answering. If you're staring deep into their eyes, it seems to make it harder to come up with the words. Is that a cultural thing? Does it seem like that, but it's not actually true, or is it actually true? And then, of course, if that is true, nature versus nurture is a whole other can of worms. But what they did in this study, and this was a study conducted by Japanese researchers Shogo Kajimura and Michio Nomura, published recently in the journal Cognition, they asked 26 study participants to look directly at a stranger's face. This was shown on a screen, so not a real person's face, but a real person's face on video. It was either looking away from the camera or looking directly into the camera, thus looking directly at the participant, and they were simultaneously asked to perform an auditory verb generation task. They were given a noun, and they were asked to give an appropriate verb for that noun. So an example might be wing, fly, or handle, pull, or something like that. They also had on their test nouns that were not as easy to pair with a verb, either because there was multiple verbs to choose from, or it was just an obscure sort of noun. If I say orchestra, do you say conduct, or listen, or applaud, or what? The scientists actually speculated going into this that if there was something that humans did not do as well while they were looking at another human face, it was going to be related to verb generation. Verbs specifically because they were thinking that coming up with verbs might have been tied in with visual imagination, and that visual imagination might have kind of been hijacked or at least distracted by staring into the depths of somebody else's eyes. But it turned out that this wasn't exactly correct, because it was only during the more difficult verb generation tasks that the slowing down became really extreme. This led the scientists to conclude that the eye contact doesn't directly interfere with the mental process is specifically related to verb generation, because if it did, they should have seen a change in reaction times across the board, maybe with that change scaling with the difficulty of the question. Instead, what they said is that their results were consistent with the idea that eye contact might drain our more general cognitive resources, the kind that we need to draw on when another task, like speaking or coming up with words on the fly, becomes too difficult to be handled by domain-specific resources. And that's why the more difficult that the story you're telling is, or the excuse that you're making up, or whatever it is, the more likely you are to break off eye contact, leading to that stuff your mother told you about always look somebody in the eye when you're talking to them so you're more trustworthy, etc., etc. As an aside, past research has shown that looking away from direct eye contact as we're speaking is something that most of us do instinctively once we're adults. But this isn't something that young children do. It's something that we learn to do gradually without ever explicitly being taught. And research has actually shown that young children can benefit from being taught to avert their gaze from people while they're trying to think. So an interesting finding for all kinds of reasons. The old looking deep into somebody's eyes turns out to be a cognitive activity unto itself.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title, twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Actually, I'm saying that as if they're new 5-star reviews. At this point, we've been having reviews pile up a little faster than I'm able to reasonably get through in any given week, which is not a bad thing, and that would not be a complaint. But these are historical 5-star reviews from the last couple of months. Somebody who had a profane iTunes handle that I cannot quite bring myself to say on this podcast, nevertheless had this to say: I have terrible ADHD, meaning I flip through TV channels, podcasts, and pretty much everything else, but you caught my attention, and this is the first podcast I've ever subscribed to. And by the way, I'm a third-year neuroscience student. And John Prees from Canada said, all the information here is concise and well presented. This podcast has only furthered my interest in pharmacology. I'm a first-year student in university, and this has helped my studies immensely by giving me a drive to reach further in my goal as a pharmacology researcher. We are now just a little teeny-tiny way into December as I record this, past Thanksgiving into the official holiday season now, and I would like to throw out a thank you to everybody that did the Black Friday Cyber Monday thing over at axonlabs.io. A lot of people stopping by to place orders for Nexus and Mitogen, the two stacks that we've got over there, a cognitive and mitochondrial support stack. I think it's safe to say that we'll be having things going on throughout the holiday period, so keep your eyes peeled. Every now and then we'll do a flash sale on social media, so if you're subscribed to the Smart Drug Smarts social media stuff, be that Facebook, Twitter, or of course our email newsletter, The Brain Breakfast, all of those are nice little early warning systems if we got something going on. But on the other hand, if you're a strike while the iron's hot type person, there is no time like the present. Axon Labs is open 24/7, 365 days a year over at that eye-catching TLD.io. TLD is top-level domain. Things like .com, .net, and yes, .io are all TLDs for you internet nomenclature aficionados out there. But yeah, Axon Labs is axonlabs.io. You can also get over there from smartdrugsmarts.com by clicking on the shop link. And my semi-predatory reminder that yes, we do have a newsletter. We would love to have you subscribe if you have not done so yet. And you can find that over at smartdrugsmarts.com/newsletter. We'll keep this one short and sweet and jump into Vitex coming up next in the main interview, but hope everyone is enjoying the start of their holiday season. And lots of good stuff planned for this month, including possibly, I dare say probably, a bonus episode or two.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So way back in episode number 118, now it's actually not that far back, but that was the first time that I spoke with Matt Legge, who is a naturopath down in Australia and the lead scientist at an online outfit called ATP Science. And in that episode, we were talking about turmeric and to a lesser extent, something called schizandra berries. And one little side shoot of that conversation that we wound up not really following up on there because it seemed worthy of a longer conversation was this.
The concept of an adaptogen is to kind of normalize the physiology, regardless of the direction of change. So often you don't get the big sweats and frights of a big surge of dopamine or something like you might from another dopaminergic agent. But interestingly, there's a little herb called Vitex that we use typically to regulate menstrual cycles. That's probably the most potent dopaminergic agent I've ever found.
So Vitex, the plant that he mentioned, seemed worthy of coming back to. I hadn't heard of it myself, but it seemed like a worthy topic to follow up on. So a month or so back, we jumped on the horn for round 2, talking all about Vitex and its extracts. So let's jump in with Matthew Legge.
Basically, Vitex agnus castus, we use the berry of a particular plant. It's otherwise known as chasteberry, but it used to be also known as monk's berry because it had a reputation in the early days of Western herbalism. So all the textbooks written in the 50s, 60s, 70s all talked about it as the monks would use it to suppress their libido. And recent research has found that doesn't actually work. In fact, if anything, it enhanced libido. So maybe they were using it for something else.
Yeah, it seemed like a good cover story.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, maybe there's a secret business that we weren't supposed to know about that we're consuming the berries for. So that's where its original history was for. But in more recent times, I would have to say about 90% of the time people use it, it is to fix premenstrual problems in women. It's for typical premenstrual symptoms such as, depression, fatigue, emotional disturbances, but other physical signs of menstrual irregularities such as too many periods or periods too often, painful menstruation, breast tenderness, swelling of the breast, and even now, more recently, it's got a reputation for treating gynecomastia, which is man boobs or moobs.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it has a lot of hormonal effects working on the menstrual cycle, and they've started looking at its ability to enhance the function of the corpus luteum, which is the sac that's left over after the woman ovulates. And that little sac is the part of the body that makes the progesterone surge. So what the Vitex does is it enhances progesterone production in the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, which basically means it increases the progesterone progesterone to offset the extra estrogen, helps to regulate the menstrual cycle and control a lot of the other hormonal pathways associated with preparing for fertility, for reproduction. Then what they did is they worked out that it actually did a lot of those effects by inhibition of prolactin. And then when they started looking at the inhibition of prolactin, they could see, so that's why it's stopping the swelling of the breast, the changing in the breast tissue, because the prolactin's associated with the gynecomastia in the males, but also with the breast tenderness, swelling, fluid retention that causes a lot of the painful breast tissue in the females leading into menstruation. Then when they found that link with the prolactin, when they were trying to discover how it was so effective at inhibiting prolactin, they worked out it did that via dopamine. Then the research on Vitex started focusing on its dopaminergic actions, looking for its potential as a nootropic or potential for controlling everything from depressions through to Parkinson's disease and that sort of stuff. So there's been a fair bit of research now done on Vitex for that. And one of the most exciting things about it for that purpose is it actually works at a very low dose. So you're not having to take mega doses. Like a lot of the research, when you read about these plant extracts, they require doses that are just outside of the realm of possible,
Not realistic to actually eat in a sitting.
Yeah, like ashwagandha, for example, which we talk about as an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor. The doses of that in some of the studies they're using equivalent to 100 and 150 grams per dose, which is a cup of dried herb, which I don't know how anyone would be capable of consuming that. So the dose range you're looking at for Vitex is as low as 1 and 2,000 milligrams. Even at the dose of 2,000 milligrams of Vitex, we can induce some of the side effects of excessive dopamine activity, such as the nausea, the dizziness, and those sort of symptoms, common side effects with overdosing of Vitex.
So when most people are taking this now, are they taking it in extract form, or is the berry actually something that somebody might eat as a food?
I've never seen it used as a berry, as a food. It's always used as an extract that I've seen in Australia.
Yeah.
But as I said, in Australia, we're a little bit strange. The country's 200-year-old, and unless we can prove a traditional food history for these things, we're not actually allowed to use it and import it and sell it. It's a little bit strange when the whole country is made up of immigrants. In Australia, they don't let us use the Australian native flora and fauna because they just call the native flora noxious weeds, and we've got to try to prove their safety, even though the indigenous community was eating it for 50,000 years. We've got to go and prove the safety. And then even though we're a country full of immigrants, we can't actually use traditional food systems from China or the Ayurvedic medicine systems because they named them traditional medicine systems. And if it's a medicine in Australia, it's regulated as such. So we're a little bit tricky here, but then extracts can be imported, no problems, and put into a product and sold. So, yeah, I can't work that out.
So for the traditional uses of Vitex, it sounds like it's generally fair to say that how it's been used for women for dealing with menstrual cycles and cramps and things like that, that's been borne out by science. But the flip side of the coin, what has been said to do for men as far as dampening down libido, that's pretty much hogwash.
Yeah, that's right. And what's interesting about it is because with Vitex, it mainly works on the D2 receptor. And with the D2 receptor, there's the postsynaptic receptor as well as the presynaptic receptor. So it is with a natural plant extract and with varying different extracts, depending on the water extract or other different solvents used, the levels of actives can change slightly, but the level of interaction with the pre or the postsynaptic receptor will determine how powerful it has as a dopaminergic effect. So basically the presynaptic D2 receptor is heavily involved in negative feedback. So people will respond slightly different to the doses. And this is typical of a plant extract. I remember last time we talked about how adaptogens, they're kind of cool in theory that if you're down, they pick you up. But if you're up, they calm you down. The plants typically try to keep you somewhere around the middle. The natural components within a lot of these herbal extracts, they push a little bit and then they don't let you go too far. So when you use the whole plant extract of Vitex, you'll see that it has an interaction with the postsynaptic receptor that does the reward centers and the alertness and the energy arousal and all those sort of things. But it also does interact with the presynaptic receptor and therefore will have a little bit of a regulatory control working on negative feedback and stopping excessive levels of activity. That's why you don't see the crazy side effects of excessive D2 activity that common, such as thank God you don't see the schizophrenias and those sort of things, and ADHD and bipolar, which are associated with excessive dopaminergic activity.
Yeah, that's definitely something I wanted to ask about. If it's promoting dopamine, is there potential for addiction or substance dependence since dopamine is so involved with craving and reward and locking in neural pathways?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because it's working on those D2 receptors. It does actually reduce cravings and it does reduce addictions, but that's why they're using the Vitex. And I always debate that, so yes, of course, while we're using something that binds into the same receptors, we're not craving that receptor modification. But if we were to take that out, have we cured the problem or created more cravings in the future or, reliance on Vitex?
Right.
But interestingly, in a clinical situation, you just never see that. And the way you actually use it, the way I used it in the naturopath clinic is we start to use it on a regular basis and then we basically can cut it out very quickly. There doesn't seem to be any rebound effects mentally. If there's ever any rebound effects when you stop the Vitex, it's typically more to do with the menstrual cycle regulation, and they'll just have a cycle where they need to get back on track.
Are there interactions with other dopaminergic compounds? Like if somebody, let's say they're a Parkinson's patient taking L-Dopa, is that somebody that should shy away from Vitex because of potential interactions or overloading on dopamine?
Yep, and that's the main interaction warning with it, is to just be aware of its interactions with dopaminergic effects. Also, too, there is interactions with such things as haloperidol, other antipsychotic medication that also interacts with the dopamine receptors, where they will, more often than not, they will just basically stop the Vitex from working. So it's usually the other way around. The drugs that are interacting with the receptors are just blocking the dopaminergic activity of the Vitex. But in the case where you're using another pharmaceutical dopaminergic compound, they will have an accumulative or additive effect on each other. But there's a lot of new research going into Vitex trying to isolate which components are having which effect on which receptor. So you'll probably see at the moment there's a lot of full whole plant extracts out there, just straight out water or ethanol extracts. But in the future, you'll probably see more specific types of extraction technology occurring and the pharmaceutical companies will start to isolate certain active ingredients out of Vitex. And the reason why that's interesting for us now is as they're developing that research and publishing those research, and before they become a regulated drug, we get the opportunity to utilize some of that information and some of those extracts within our, on ourselves and in our clinics. Some of the things they're looking at using Vitex for in the very near future is they're doing a bit of trials on it now with restless leg syndrome and anti-epileptic activity.
Yeah.
So we know the man boobs, we know that the gyno, all the other premenstrual stuff, anti-epileptic, restless leg syndrome, and then all these other menstrual sort of effects. And all of those effects in dose ranges from 500 milligrams up to about 1,000 milligrams once a day.
So I'm guessing if you're taking this once a day, then the effects are relatively acute. You're needing to re-up the supply. It's something that gets cleaned out of your bloodstream relatively quickly.
Yeah, interestingly, what we seem to find is when people first take the Vitex, they feel the dopaminergic effects quite quickly. It does have a very quick acting effect. And then when people take it regularly over a period of months to regulate the menstrual cycle, the actual dopaminergic brain effects start to reduce, where we seem to become desensitized to those dopaminergic interactions. And then the effects on the menstrual cycle become more pronounced. So you'll probably find the better way to use Vitex as a dopaminergic agent is to use it periodically. In fact, for premenstrual depressions and those sort of conditions, it was often used just for the week or 10 days leading into the menstrual cycle to fix anxiety, to fix depression and fatigue and apathy. And it worked very quickly. And then they take it out and then just bring it back in. For the dopaminergic effects, you're better off using it just in short-term blasts at about a dose of about 1,000 or 2,000 milligrams. When we make a product and that sort of stuff, we try to dose it around 1,000 milligrams per day because most people will double dose anyway. And then they come back and say, with the 2,000 milligrams, it's kind of making them feel a bit nauseous.
Too much of a good thing.
And it's interesting, a lot of those antiemetic drugs, the anti-nausea drugs, work by inhibition of the D2 receptors, so it does all start to fit into a nice pattern.
How long do you find that it takes somebody, once they've built up a bit of a tolerance, to kind of lose that tolerance? If you wash it out of your system, how long does that washout period take?
When you're looking at Vitex, it's only about 3 days. Doesn't take long at all. Just depends on what other dopaminergic agents may be in there. But typically, if you take a break from Vitex for a couple of days, then it seems to be, you feel that effect again. But it does take about 6 weeks for you to feel that resistance to its dopaminergic activity. So you can use it for a decent period of time and still get the dopaminergic activity before you have a break.
And when people are looking for Vitex supplement, are there different types of extracts that one is good and other is bad, or is it sort of all done in the same way? I mean, like what might somebody look for in the retail world?
Most of the research is done on the ethanolic extracts of the whole berry. They're not isolating particular active ingredients out of it at the moment to make pharmaceutical grade extracts or spiked up extracts. So all the suppliers at this stage are usually providing an ethanolic extract or a water extract, but all the research is done on the ethanolic extracts. So that's what I tend to look for, ethanolic extract that way.
I know you're an Australian. This might be different in different parts of the world, but do you have particular brands or labels that you feel safe safe recommending? Suppliers that you feel good about?
Yeah, we got a supplier for the raw material, but we do the manufacturing and we put it into our product called Alpha Venus. It's a 10-to-1 ethanol extract of the Vitex. I tell you some interesting things. It's quite funny because we do a lot of work with sponsored athletes. We do a lot of work with bodybuilders and UFC fighters, and this dopaminergic effect is just so important when you're dealing with an athlete. So they have that confidence and that to attack and not have that hesitation. And it's quite interesting because I noticed when a lot of these studies that they're doing on these animal studies looking for dopaminergic effect in an animal, when they can't really talk to an animal about self-esteem and confidence and that sort of stuff.
Well, you can. It just doesn't work that well.
Yeah, you do it with a horse. You just start by saying, well, why the long face? That's my horse joke. So the dopaminergic and cholinergic pathways, I don't know if you've noticed, but in the new medical journals, they're talking about this visual way of knowing if they're having the combination of dopamine and the choline effect at once, which is a yawning and genital grooming is what they're actually looking for in the animals now. So they're loading them up and they're using the degree of yawning in combination with genital grooming as a dopamine cholinergic effect. So it's funny with the studies, I'm going to add that into our new product development trials that we do with our athletes. It'll be quite funny.
It's sort of a famous bad idea to mix stimulants and depressants. Since there are some stimulant excitatory effects to Vitex, should people that are on any sort of depressant medication steer clear of Vitex for that reason?
No, it's quite interesting. Because that D2 receptor has that presynaptic negative feedback control as well, it does actually help. It makes it a safer product to combine other things with because it will stop that excessive dopamine release. See, cocaine, for example, if it's blocking the removal of dopamine, allowing the dopamine to flood through the synapse, typically if there's something still causing dopamine release, then you can get into major problems. But when you've got something working on the presynaptic dopamine negative feedback pathway at the same time, it's actually a much safer combination. So it doesn't seem to have those sort of problems. And like I said, it is probably the most powerful plant extract for dopamine effects. But because of how powerful it is at controlling the prolactin and all these other dopamine-like effects, yet it seems very safe and easy to play with. It works like a happy pill for many people, and you can combine it with most other things, and it doesn't seem to have any sort of problems. There is a very mild serotonergic effect as well, but that hasn't been significantly studied or substantially studied enough.
Other than painstakingly teasing apart what all the active ingredients are within Vitex, are there any other studies, things that you wish would be done to soothe some burning curiosity about what Vitex can do or might be capable of therapeutically?
Yeah, my main thing is I'd love to know which extracts, or if it's the same extract that's controlling the presynaptic and postsynaptic. And I'm a naturopath and I like to follow the laws of nature, and I love how nature tries to keep things in the middle wherever possible, but I'd also like to be more, I might have delusions of grandeur or something, but I'd like to be able to manipulate these things better, because if I want to have a full-on dopamine effect and control that effect of dopaminergic activity and not necessarily equally be working on negative feedback to get more of an oomph out of this thing, that's where I'd like to know the breakdown of the active constituents and find out which ones are the on switches and which ones are the off switches, so we can play around with it, have a little bit more power over the effects that we get out of it. I do believe too that there should be a lot more research going into it for its effects with the epilepsy and restless leg syndromes and those sort of other dopaminergic effects. But mainly, I just really want to know how that herb works so I can tailor-make a combination of different extracts out of the one plant to have more or less dopaminergic effect, because if it can work on both the presynaptic and postsynaptic and we can identify which part of it does which, then we have the ability to modulate the dopaminergic effects, but also then maybe inhibit the excessive dopaminergic activity associated with such things as schizophrenia and ADHD. And that would be done through the presynaptic receptors, and then we work on the fatigue, the depressions, the apathy, substance abuse and everything on the postsynaptic receptors. I think that would be a very powerful tool to know.
Yeah, it's great having the built-in safety mechanism, but it's like if we could figure out how that track was laid, then you could change the tracks or lay the tracks going off in new directions.
Oh, no, I just love the ability to be able to take control of our own physiology and actually have a good understanding of what we're doing and create tools specific for our requirements. And I know nature's got the ability to do it. We just need to understand it a little bit better and know how and when to apply which type of extract.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Like you mentioned, how there can be push and pull mechanisms on the same physiological levers within the same plant. We had an episode recently about cannabis, and I remember that some of the cannabinoids dampen the effects of other ones. And then sometimes also you'll have bioactive compounds that in one species it's a poison, like nicotine in plants is a natural insecticide. Obviously has completely different effects if you're a human tophaco smoker than if you're an aphid.
Yeah. Another component that's in Vitex that's quite interesting as well while we're talking about insects is it naturally contains these things called phytosteroids. They have recently been isolated as possibly the most potent anabolic agent known to man that's supplied by nature, having effects similar to anabolic steroids for muscle growth. And interestingly, these compounds are found typically in the leaves of the plant, not the berry, but the insects seek them out and specifically look for these phytosteroids when they have to increase the size of their exoskeleton. So in the process of shedding their skeleton, growing a new exoskeleton, they actually seek out these natural anabolic steroids to induce the hypertrophy they need to achieve it. Those phytosteroids have also now been studied in all sorts of mammals and found to have exactly the same effect in mammals as they do in insects, where they can increase protein synthesis, burn fat, and everything. It's an amazing herb, and I think we're a long way from understanding it fully.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Matthew Legge for taking the time for that conversation. You can find out all about what he's up to and read a lot of his work over at atpscience.com. And yeah, really interesting learning about Vitex, the various things that it can do, and the potential that science has to still look further under the hood at the subcomponents, what's doing what within the human body, possibly being able to even find some more therapeutically effective ways to use this plant. Even those that we know about already are interesting. I love the story from the beginning there about how this was originally called the chasteberry, and it was something that monks used to squelch their libido, when in fact it's possibly doing the opposite. Somewhat related, somewhat on the topic of libidos, or at least of human procreation, I saw a study recently that I wanted to tie into this episode. Also kind of a segue to next week's episode, which is going to be about families. But let's jump ahead, if I haven't already, to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts, ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So probably one of the more consequential decisions that a person makes during the course of their life is whether to have kids and how many kids to have in that case. And there's all sorts of factors that play into this, but one of them we probably don't think about, and possibly now we should, is brought to light by a recent study. This was conducted at the University of Southern California and published just recently in the Journal of the American Geriatric Society. And it was looking at 830 different women who on average were 60 years old. This data was adjusted for age, race, ethnicity, all that sort of stuff. And what this found, kind of counterintuitively, is that the age at which a woman experiences her last pregnancy has a significant impact on her cognitive performance later in life. And it's a positive effect. The older that a woman is when she has her last baby, the better that she tends to perform cognitively as an older woman. The study's lead author was Roxana Karim, an assistant professor of clinical preventative medicine at the Keck School of Medicine at USC. And according to her, this is the first study to look into the effects of cognitive performance on the age of final pregnancy. Pregnancies, we probably all know, lead to surging hormones in a woman, different than she's going to have at any other point in her life. But probably those of us living in the modern world have sort of a parochial thoughts about pregnancy being this once or twice or a few times in a lifetime thing. Whereas if we were living according to the nature of our hominid ancestors, probably being pregnant would have been the default state of women through most of their adult lives. And so the hormone state of the body seen during pregnancy would have been a much more natural one that the brain is probably physiologically expecting. And that does line up with what this study's results found. Study participants were given a series of tests that included assessments of their verbal memory, psychomotor speed, attention and concentration, planning, visual perception, and memory. Also found to be cognitively beneficial was the total duration of time between a woman's first and her last period. This longer reproductive lifespan proved valuable for executive function, said Karim. Starting your period early means you have higher levels of the female sex hormone being produced by the ovaries. Girls are receiving the optimal levels early, so it's possible that their brain structures are better developed compared to those who are exposed to estrogen levels associated with menstrual cycles at a later age. For those women looking to experience the benefits of enhanced cognition later in life without staying pregnant for 10 years at a stretch, it was also found that use of the pill or other hormonal contraceptives for at least 10 years was beneficial for verbal memory and critical thinking ability, said Karim. Oral contraceptives maintain and sustain a stable level of sex hormones in our bloodstream, and stable is good. One thing that's interesting about this study is that it's a counterpoint to some earlier studies talking about what's been called pregnancy brain, where pregnant women were found to have poorer verbal memory, word fluency, and word list learning compared to non-pregnant women. But what those studies didn't do is look at the effects on the woman's brain after the pregnancy was over, or in the case of this most recent study, the effects on the brain years and even decades after the pregnancy had ended.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so you heard it. That is the entire episode number 157 coming in for a landing. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find the links to everything that we discussed here online at smartdrugsmarts.com/157. Last week's episode, in case you missed it, was about lead poisoning. Not the happiest, cheeriest topic, but something to put the fear of God into your brain cells when it comes to any stray lead atoms that might be floating around your environment. Next week, in episode number 158, we're going to be talking about our intellectual endowment that we get from family members, basically the ways in which our genes and even epigenetics can influence influence our brains. Really interesting stuff, looking at longitudinal studies following people for many, many years and between generations, what that can tell us about the human brain. Figured that would be some good family holiday time trivia that you can share with family members as you're getting together this holiday season. So tune in for that next Friday when I will be back. Same time, same podcast, and with an entirely non-seasonal, because we're here every darn season of the year, commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great week and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only. Although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.